So welcome to today's conversation. We are very lucky and happy to have the opportunity to invite Professor Derewianka from Wollongong University. And Professor Derewianka is a very famous systemic functional linguist and educator. And then I'm Winfred, and here are my cohorts, Nancy and Tomoko. Let's welcome Derewianka.
Thank you very much.
So how are you doing?
I'm fine. I've just arrived and so had a long trip, but I'm fine.
Since
now.
we have known you have a lot of stories and experience with Hong Kong, so do you still remember how many times have you been to Hong Kong?
The first time I came to Hong Kong was before you were born.
Wow.
So, yes. I lived here for 2 years when I had just graduated, so about 40 years ago.
Oh.
So you're not 40, are you? So I lived here for 2 years then, and then I've come back every few years. So regular visitor.
Oh, regular visitor.
Yes.
So did you have your chance to go sightseeing in Hong Kong?
Many times. I think I've seen everything because I lived here for a couple of years when I was working at Hong Kong University.
Yes.
So yes, I think I've seen everything.
Oh,
Well,
fantastic.
not quite everything. I have to leave a few things up in the air.
So do you like Hong Kong cuisine?
Yes, I do. Yes. It's hard to tell which is exactly Hong Kong cuisine.
Chinese.
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah, so since Pauline, you and you have a lot of relationship and cooperation, so according to all these years, so can you share your experience in these kind of collaborations?
Well, gosh, the first time I came here was about 12 years ago, and I was working with Gail and various other people at that stage. So over the years, I've again come back to PolyU about every year or two, and sometimes to do research projects, but usually just to catch up and meet with people like yourselves and see what you're doing in terms of your theses.
Wow, that's good.
Yeah. So we really greatly value your expertise in educational linguistics of our department. Yeah, as we know that you have been a consultant in the Hong Kong U project, which is provide professional support to the Hong Kong primary and secondary school teachers.
Mm-hmm.
Would you share some of experience of that?
Yes, that was the Telenex
Yes,
project.
yes.
Yeah, it was founded by Professor Amy Choi,
Mm-hmm.
and I worked for about 2.5 years at Hong Kong University on that project.
Mm-hmm.
The project itself went for about 6 years,
Yeah.
so there were people like Graham who were also on the project. Many people worked on that project. I think it was probably at the time one of the most groundbreaking projects of its kind in the world. Nobody else was doing that kind of thing. It was just when the internet had been invented.
Oh, yeah.
And so, to do such a huge project and make all of that information and activities and all kinds of things available to teachers was, I think, quite forward-looking at the time. Unfortunately, even though many people worked on it over many years and a lot of money was spent on it, and I think it's still one of the best resources that we have for SFL in schools, people don't seem to be using it. So this is a problem, I think, and so I think it would be lovely if people could realise that it's there and it's a wonderful resource. But how to get them to use it, that's another matter. But again, I think as far as SFL goes, that's one of the most well-developed resources that we have internationally.
SFL often faces resistance, maybe because the meta language is difficult and
Mhm.
framework is complex.
Yeah.
So what is the best way to overcome this kind of resistance, do you think?
Yep. It depends who you're working with. If you're working with young children, they have no problem at all, depending on how you start.
Yes.
It's the teachers that feel that it's difficult and overwhelming. But I think you can get around that by saying, well, we're going to start with functions and meaning as a starting point. And they're fine with that. It's when they have to look at the relationship between the function and the grammatical form that they start to become confused. So when we do it, when I do workshops with teachers, I start just with function. We start with the 3 questions. We start with transitivity because that's, to them, the most obvious one. And I just start with the 3 questions, you know, what's happening, who or what's involved, are there any details surrounding the activity? And we very gradually then introduce the functional terms, and then at some later point we'll talk about nominal groups and verbal groups, prepositional phrases, but that's when it starts to become difficult. And traditional grammar is difficult. If they know their traditional grammar, it's much more difficult than, or just as difficult if you like, as a functional grammar, but you can't do a lot with it. So, you know, if they think that traditional grammar is just nouns, verbs and adjectives, you start asking them about adverbs, prepositional phrases.
Oh my gosh.
So, and then all the rest that goes with traditional grammar. So no, I think depending on what your starting point is, how slowly you introduce it, whether you do a lot of work with images, I do a lot of work using visual supports, and after a full day's workshop with teachers, they come away feeling confident and excited to go and try things out. But you don't try to do everything at once. You have to think about how you're going to introduce it over a long period of time.
Well, that's really very interesting and valuable experience from, giving workshops to teachers and then to equip the language teachers to use the framework, right? Because I was an English teacher before, and I found that it was really difficult. Even for traditional grammar or SFL, for teachers to teach, especially as foreign languages. Yeah, so I think from your perspective, I think it would be very interesting and give all these things step by step to the teachers. It would be very good for us, I think.
And as I said, you've got to think about what they come with. If they come with a really good knowledge of traditional grammar, then of course you have to build on that. You have to acknowledge that.
Oh.
But I find that a lot of people don't have a really good knowledge of traditional grammar, or they have a very old-fashioned traditional grammar. And so for them it's better to just say, put that out of your mind for now. We're going to start afresh with something that makes sense to the students, and then gradually acknowledge their background in traditional grammar.
So going back to your early research, as you know, when we mention about grammatical metaphors, so nowadays everybody refer to your works. So, and I'm also initiating a project on grammatical metaphor these days. So it was very interesting to refer to your seminal papers and your PhD thesis, etc., etc. So. Could you please elaborate a little bit? Why did you choose this topic as your PhD project? Because we are all very young PhD students, and it's very interesting and to listen to your story as a kind of help us young researchers. Yeah.
Okay, all right. Well, first of all, my work was not seminal. The seminal works, of course, were from Halliday, and then people like Louise Ravelli and Claire Painter. And so what I was interested in, I had children, and they were just starting in school, and so I thought, well, I want to look at the children's language development, and by the time they were getting into late primary school, I thought, well, grammatical metaphor is the obvious thing to look at, because Halliday had always said that it's in early adolescence that it really starts to come to the fore. But nobody had actually researched that. This was an observation, a hypothesis by Halliday, but we didn't have any data. So Halliday had done the very early language development, and Claire Painter had taken that into early childhood and early primary school, but nobody had done that later language development from later primary into secondary school. So I just thought, well, there's an opportunity. When you're doing research, you always look for that niche, the gap. So there was a gap there. And it let me observe my children very carefully and their language development. So I collected everything that they wrote from early childhood right through to late adolescence. So I have boxes and boxes at home, all of their writing, everything they ever did, and interviews with them along the way and that kind of thing. So, in terms
That's
of
fantastic.
Well,
Yeah.
it was an interesting study, and it gives you an opportunity to interact very closely with your children.
Yeah, and then and that can be really to kill two birds with one stone.
Well, yes, they didn't always appreciate it, but no, they were very cooperative.
Yeah.
Interesting,
So,
yeah. Yeah, as you just mentioned, Michael Halliday, Claire Painter, and also your works has been really focusing on the research and studies of language, of English as a first language. So what do you think about the research and also activities about English as a second language? And also, as we know that you are the coordinator of the Tesol program of your university, could you share some experience of activities or research on this language as English as a second language researches?
Right, so in Australia, of course, we would be referring to English as a second language.
Yeah.
And I think we need to distinguish between English as a foreign language
Yes.
and English as a second language.
Yes.
Because I think if you're teaching English as a foreign language, then you probably do have to focus more on grammatical structure than you do with English as a second language. So you will use the grammar differently, and you will probably have a different focus in English as a foreign language. Now in Hong Kong, of course, goodness knows what it is. Is it English as a second language? Is it English as a foreign language? What do you think?
It's too complicated, this
It's
question.
complicated.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, because
yes.
you know, in Hong Kong we have English, and we have different kinds of English: American English, British English, Australian English, and even and we also have Cantonese and Mandarin. So
Well, that's right.
It's
That's
always,
right.
I mean, when language education comes to Hong Kong, this context, it's always, I mean, difficult to define. So which direction and which avenue we are in.
That's right.
So yeah.
Yep. But I think whichever one, whether it's English as a foreign language or as a second language, I think SFL can inform the programs and the curriculum if you start at that big level of, you know, what's your purpose for using language.
Yes.
And that helps you to identify the different purposes for which students need to use the language. And that gives us the different academic genres and community genres that they'll need to use. Unfortunately, quite often we start down at the level of grammatical forms and sort of build up from there. But I think if you are able to do that kind of analysis of the context and identify what it is that your students need to be able to do, then, and this is, if it's English as a second language, they need to be able to use English in the community and in the school, because that is the language that surrounds them. But if it's English as a foreign language, that immediate urgent need to use language isn't there. So that's a little more difficult.
You did mention that systemic functional linguistics has its ability to inform of teaching English as a second language or foreign language.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yes, but I think, as I said, the focus in English is a foreign language, and here you have a mixture of
Yes.
both.
Oh
I
yeah.
think.
Yes.
And it depends on the individual student and the context. In the Hong Kong context, you have a lot of English being used in daily life, in business life, in schools, etc. So it's kind of English as a second language,
Yeah.
but for many students,
Mm.
it's a foreign language because they don't use it in their daily lives. So if it's a second language, then yes, I think SFL can really inform it very clearly.
Mm.
If it's a foreign language for some students, then I think the starting point might be different.
Yes.
And you do have to focus also quite a bit on structure and form.
Very insightful
Yes.
ideas. Yes. So I mean, after your discussion of these parts, coming back to the Australian context. So, can you share your experience? I mean, what is unique in applying SFL to Tesol program in Australia? So I mean, compare with the other programs around the world. Yeah. So always different context.
Oh, compared with other programs around the world. I guess we've been so fortunate in having Michael Halliday in Australia.
Yeah.
And
Sure.
so that has made a huge impact on the work that we do in Australia. I go to the UK, where he came from, of course. We were lucky to get him. But in the UK, they've never fully embraced a functional approach in an ESL program. They have they still have remnants of a functional notional approach, the communicative approach, which didn't have a firm theory of language attached to it. But it was a good start. And then, so they've continued along that way, and in America, of course, we've got the Chomskyan approach.
Yeah, Chomsky and always competition.
Yes. So in different countries, we've got different histories, different traditions. And our tradition in Australia has been very much one of an SFL-based approach. And I think it's had a big influence on our pedagogy, on the materials, on the resources, on the teacher training programs. All of those things have been influenced by SFL. But having said that, it depends where you went to university, it depends which state you're in. In each state it looks slightly different. So it's not as if, it's the same in any country. You can't say that a whole country has adopted a single approach and to the same degree.
Yeah.
So, in Australia we have some very well-informed SFL practitioners, and we have other ones who've never heard of it.
Yeah, so that is what diversity is, right?
Yes, yes.
Yeah. Very interesting.
Mm-hmm.
And speaking of teaching English as a program or as a national educational program, and as we know that you are a participant in the first developing an Australian national curriculum, then would you share some experience of that? Yeah.
Right. It was a very political exercise. We have been trying for the last 20 years or so to have a national curriculum. Every state has its own set of syllabuses, very different. So we've got some that are highly centralised, where you have to follow the curriculum almost by the word. Other ones virtually say, do what you like. So it was very difficult to get all of the states to agree on a national curriculum. So we've had about 3 attempts, and this is the first time that it's really been taken seriously. All of the states agreed, yes, we will do this, finally. It's taken about 3 years to get it to the point where people are starting to implement it. But even then, the states are very different. So we have South Australia, and you work with people like John Polius, Brian Dare, etc. And they have started very quickly and developed wonderful teacher resources and professional development courses to support the curriculum.
Yes.
And they're doing very good work. In New South Wales, we've hardly started to think about it. We're not going to introduce it for another year or two in New South Wales. And they have also decided to interpret it very differently from the rest of the states. So when you say a national curriculum, yes, it's national in a way, but each state wants to have its own way of saying this is our interpretation of the national curriculum. So it's very hard to develop common resources and common teacher education programs because they've all got a slightly different way of looking at it. So it's been very interesting. I think it'll be a very long-term process. I think it will take probably about 10 years until we all feel that it is a national curriculum and we all agree on the principles, the core principles.
Yeah, I think
Amazing.
it's always difficult. It's like in Hong Kong context, like EMI and CMI, right?
Yes.
Yeah,
yes.
it's always
Mhm.
difficult to decide
Yes.
which direction you go.
That's right,
Yeah.
and it-
So this is very
Mhm.
political thing. So
Hugely
yeah.
political and ideological.
So I mean, how could your team have overcome these kind of difficulties when you just from academic and then want to change the policy level things? Yeah, I think this is very interesting for Hong Kong context, I think.
Well, I was on the writing team and we didn't actually do all of that work leading up to it, but we were employed to actually write the document. And it was just, we had to make so many compromises.
Oh,
There was-
I can imagine.
There were so many. We're actually doing a research project at the moment, using a Bernsteinian framework. So we're looking at the different fields, starting with the knowledge development field, the knowledge field, and how that is recontextualised by the policymakers. And then the policymakers, you've got not only the policy, the curriculum committees and boards and things, but you've also got the media, you've got the politicians, you've got everybody being consulted, and we had to take account of all of that input, all the feedback.
Yeah.
Some people who hated grammar, some people who loved traditional grammar, some people, we had to somehow make it acceptable to everyone. But then, of course, there's another level of recontextualisation, and that's at the state level. So they've then recontextualised again, and now we're looking at how the teachers are interpreting it in the classroom. So it's very interesting to see that interpretation of theory and research at that level to policy and into the classroom. And some people are doing wonderful things with it, really exciting, innovative work, and others are totally confused.
Yes.
And fairly cynical about it.
It's really influential. I mean, a national curriculum, and you have made a great leap, I think, in this step.
Well, we were helped because the person who developed the framework, that's Professor Peter Freebody, is very sympathetic to SFL. And so he wanted to make it a radical shift from the previous syllabuses, which were always organised around reading, writing, speaking, listening, what we call the modes. He wanted to get rid of that and make people think again for the 21st century. So he said, what do we mean by English as a discipline? And he said the core values in English are language, literature and literacy. And so the whole curriculum was organised around those three strands. So I was pretty much responsible for the language strand, and I thought, well, I can only use SFL. What else could you use? But we had to disguise it, because there are a lot of people, as you say, who think that SFL is very complex, very, too hard for the students, etc. So what we did was to have 3 sub-strands that in fact are the meta functions. But we had to call them things like interacting with language and using language to represent our experience, our ideas, etc. And structuring texts that are coherent and cohesive. So the framework was there, and that was important to have the framework that we can later build on. So South Australia, for example, was able to say this is an SFL curriculum because here are the meta functions. And then that gave it legitimacy. But other people who don't know about SFL, they don't see that in there. And so some people could read it as a traditional grammar type of approach, because our Prime Minister wanted it to be traditional grammar. So we had to be subversive and say, well, we'll play the Prime Minister's game, but we'll also play our own game.
Interesting, really interesting. And speaking of national curriculum, as we know that Hong Kong has just updated Hong Kong national curriculum last year. And there is, with your experience that with interaction with teachers and practitioners and educators, how would you encourage change in the pedagogical practice? Yeah.
Oh, that's a hard one, isn't it?
Yeah, there is as there is a saying, there is nothing wrong with the change, if it is in the right direction.
Especially for the teachers who have worked so many years on traditional grammar.
Yes.
So when your national curriculum carry out, and how can you inform them and to make them, persuade them to use your SFL oriented framework? Yeah.
I think you have to do it through evidence. And if there are things using traditional grammar, particularly to do with accuracy and structure, and if they can be shown to work and to make changes in students' English, fine, let's use that. But let's also get evidence of how SFL can also make huge changes in students' writing and reading. So I think you need, first of all, to work with selected teachers in schools and get them to become familiar with SFL and think about how it can be implemented in their classrooms. Then document, and this is the kind of work that people are doing here, and John Folius and other people have been doing. So to document how SFL can be used very productively, and therefore how students' use of English improves greatly. And as soon as you have evidence like that, I think that's when you can start to persuade people. Videotape teachers in the classroom so that you can demonstrate good practice and how they're going about using it. Write it up, get it out into the journals, professional journals. So again, we've been doing this in Australia for 30 more years.
Yeah, it's a huge project.
Yes. So we're not under any illusion that the whole country is going to change because of a national curriculum. But we know that the schools that are implementing it that it does make a difference. And we'll just continue working with them. Forget the politics, forget the ideology, forget everybody who says, oh, it's all too hard, and just work with what we know works best and have the evidence to show it.
Yes. Evidence provided by researchers like us.
Yeah, exactly, yes.
Very
Which
inspiring.
is why your work is so important here.
Thank you. I hope so. That's really inspiring. From your experience and project, and I think we can apply this in Hong Kong context too. If Yeah.
Well, yes, it's
we
the
have
same
more
with anything,
opportunities.
isn't it?
Yeah.
You,
Yeah.
You've got to have the evidence and
Evidence,
demonstrate to.
yeah, and the selected teachers, and you inform the
Yes.
whole school,
Mhm.
and then step by
Yes,
step.
start small and make sure that those teachers that feel comfortable and confident with it and
Mhm.
are using it
Mhm.
really well in the classroom, document it, videotape it, and then build on that.
Yeah, it's very concrete. These are all the stories behind the papers. We could not, we could not read this from the papers, the publications. So
Yeah.
it's really interesting, huh? Yeah. So since you have carried out lots of teachers' workshops for teachers, and then to inform them to use SFL in their language teaching, no matter first language or second language. So could you please tell us from your experience, how can you, which part the teachers value most, from your previous experience,
Mhm, mhm.
if you're going to carry out some workshop for the local teachers?
Right, right. I always like to start with refreshing their knowledge about genre. We take it for granted in Australia because all of our syllabuses have been genre-based syllabuses.
Yes.
But it's become a bit of an orthodoxy and, it's a bit of a routine. So I like to go back and get them to rethink what they mean by genre. So that's always your starting point, because any language work you're doing in relation to a particular genre. So if we're talking about language as choice, and we always develop the principles as we go through the workshop. So, we're talking about meaning and function and choice and language as a resource. So getting away from that notion of grammar as some punishment if you get things wrong, for example. So making sure that that their approach to language is not one that, associated with traditional grammar. And as I said, I always start with transitivity once we start to get into the grammar, and start with lots of visual images and activity with the students, the children, actually doing grammar physically. So, if we're doing material processes, action verbs.
Oh yeah, I
we
read
get up and
the book of Frances Christie and yours, and then I found that you guys applied the framework in children's language learning in the classroom from kindergarten.
Oh yes.
So they know the
Yes.
terms from, the early beginning of their education.
That's right.
So it made them
Yes.
become much easier, familiar with this approach.
Yeah.
So we have to block the way for the future development.
Well,
Yeah.
that's in theory how it's supposed to work.
Yeah.
So, if in the early years, the very early years of schooling, they're starting to just have an understanding of how a clause, whether they use the term or not, how a clause works in terms of, what's happening, who's involved, what are the circumstances, colour coding that, doing lots of activities around that. Then that's a wonderful foundation in later years for them building on things like clause complexes and taking it further into the textual metafunction and the interpersonal metafunction.
Yeah, so, and coming back to the, just now you mentioned genre is is the most appreciated and valued by the teachers from the workshop. So, I'm also thinking about another problem, because for genre, there was something like very critique. People don't like to say, people opposite to say that, no, genre is like, it's too dogged, and it's like step by step, and then you just teach the students, and then every student produces the same kind of passage, the writing, so there's no diversity among the writing, something like that. So, how can you deal with this kind of opinion or kind of disagreement when you do these kinds of workshops?
Well, that's how I start, by disagreeing with that. By saying, let's look at the misconceptions around genre, because it has become like a formula that the students follow exactly. So I'd say, let's go back and think about what are the purposes for which they need to use language. And let's get away from this idea of a straitjacket that they must follow these steps.
Yeah.
And talk about, there are some genres and their stages are much more predictable than others.
Mhm.
So, for example, a procedure has to be predictable,
Mm.
otherwise we'd have chaos.
Mm.
But there are other ones, of course, poetry is where you break the rules. There's still an element of predictability, certainly there is, but you can be much more creative. So I think people react to it when you get into the more literary genres and they say, yes, but what about the imagination? What about creativity? Well, of course, if you know the resources that you have to play with and you know what the rules, the usual rules are, then you can break those rules. Not the, or patterns, perhaps might be a better way of talking about it.
But I mean, when you carry out the genre approach, like for the, a genre, this theory was originated from Professor Jim Martin's projects in the disadvantaged school in Australia, right?
Mm-hmm.
So how about for the talented students? Because you just give a piece of text to them, maybe they have already mapped out each step of the genre. So to different students, especially level. So how can you deal with this kind of problem when you carry out teaching?
Well, first of all, I think that what you might call gifted and talented students, the high achievers, they can always be stretched further. And they're often the ones that appreciate having a knowledge of the tools just to stretch their writing. But we're probably more concerned with the ones who are struggling. And they're the ones, I think, that really benefit from knowing, from having explicit teaching about the language that they need in their schooling. So, do you have here differentiation in the curriculum? This is a term that's all the way through Australia now, the differentiated curriculum, differentiated learning, where each teacher does the same, has the same topic, the same theme in the lesson, but within that makes sure that some students are stretched, other students are highly supported, and so the activities have to be differentiated to cater for all the different levels of achievement in the classroom. So, is that something you have here? You probably do.
Yeah.
Internationally, it seems to be the latest fad. So most of the teachers in Australia would differentiate their planning, their programming.
So it's very interesting to listen to your story. So, coming back to the whole faculty as a whole faculty. So, for this kind of future education, so how do you preserve as a students in humanities, how to equip ourselves, no matter undergraduate or PhD students? So, can you give us some feedback to Hong Kong students? I think this is very interesting.
I can only talk about our experience in Australia.
Yeah.
You're the experts in Hong Kong. So if you're talking about how you move students from undergraduate work right up to PhD, so
Yeah.
it depends on the university. Every university in Australia has a different undergraduate program. So some will have an SFL stream in their linguistics department. In education faculties where I work, some will use SFL in their literacy programs. Then some of those students will go on and do master's work, and they'll do an intensive master's program in SFL, or including SFL, not in SFL entirely. And those are the ones that usually go on and do PhD work. But I'm not sure if that answers or addresses your question.
Yeah, I think so.
It's very much the same here, of course, almost everywhere.
So one of the most interesting difficulties for here is some of the students, they came from Chinese CMI background, so Chinese as a medium instruction, and then they move into university, they began to the EMI, all the instruction as English. So that's the difficult part for some of the students coming from that background to adjust themselves in the university life and also in the university education.
I think that's a huge problem. And of course that's also very political, because it means that there are going to be some students who are hugely disadvantaged that haven't had English as the medium of instruction until they get to university.
Yes.
And then suddenly they have this very abstract, specialist, technical language to deal with at university level. So I'm, on the one hand, very impressed with the students who do succeed in that endeavour. I think they do an amazing job, and I don't know how they do it. I couldn't do it myself. But I do feel for the ones who don't succeed in that, and I can certainly see the argument for having Mandarin or Cantonese, whatever, as the medium of instruction, because I think, in a sense, it's very unfair to ask them to study in English, and it probably means that they don't achieve their potential because they're having to read and write and listen in a foreign language. But then you've got all the pressures, of course, of globalisation, where unfortunately at this stage it's English that is in demand. So it's a huge problem, a big issue, and I don't know what the answer is. Yes.
Fantastic. So as wrapping up, and then we just want to ask another questions like, do you have any exciting blueprints in your mind for next step? Can you share?
For me personally?
Yeah.
Well,
stay in Hong Kong forever.
please.
And come to John Pauline.
Well, no, actually, I'm getting old.
No, you are young.
No. And I'm moving into retirement, so I'm working 2 days a week now at
That's good.
Wollongong, which leaves me 3 days, well, actually 5 days a week to do other work. So I'm doing a lot of work going all around Australia and helping students, helping teachers to implement the new curriculum. So I'm having a wonderful time.
Oh,
I'm visiting
exciting.
everywhere,
Wow, cool.
all over Australia and internationally. So it's a wonderful time in my life, and it means I can also do the kind of research that you don't get time to do when you're a full-time academic, which is so ironic. You know, getting out, getting into schools and actually working with the students, working with the teachers, very long-term projects. We usually have to go and do quick projects, but now we're doing over a number of years, seeing how the students develop, how the teachers come to understand the new curriculum. So it's a lovely time in my life, but what I really want to do in terms of the next project is we recognise that the pool of people with expertise in SFL is limited. And if we're going to support all the teachers in Australia, then we can't do it on a one-to-one, face-to-face basis in workshops. So we want to develop a series of materials for students so that it goes immediately to the students. The teachers learn with the students. We want it to be digital, so probably iBooks, where we can, very much like we've been talking about with the science project, where we can embed video materials, animations, all kinds of visual images, etc., interactive, and having that from the very early years right through, and using SFL as a basis for all of those materials, so that by the time they get up into upper secondary school, they will have very good basis for their knowledge about language as well as their use of language.
And you can
So-
also visualize the grammatic metaphor, right?
Well, yes, yes, exactly, yes. Yes, so that's my dream for when I actually do retire, but I can't see that happening for a little while yet.
But we really welcome you to come back again to share your
Yeah.
future stories with us.
Well, I'd certainly love to. It's always a great pleasure coming back here.
Yeah, we are very glad to have you here. Yeah,
Thank you.
thank you so much.
Yeah. Thank you for your time. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.